one of the most controversial geologists, and just a great human being, Dr. Robert Schoch.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here, and thank you, Walter, very much for making this possible over the years. And once again, it's really nice to be here and see both a lot of old friends and also new faces. So I'm really pleased to be back. I'm going to talk for, I'm told, until no later than 12:30. So we can have lunch. But what I want to say in that is that many of us always feel we can have more time, so I'm going to try to cover some things very quickly, and I'll be happy to take questions if we don't have time at the end now. But, you know, just stop by, talk to me during lunch, or I'll be here the entire session. A lot of you know that I'm a geologist, as John West, who's somewhere in the audience, would say, I geologize. It's just a picture of me geologizing, collecting rock samples. So I really do this. This is in Peru in particular. But what many of you are aware is that I'm probably best known in certain circles for my work on the Sphinx. I'm only going to mention that very briefly because I sort of feel like I have to, because in many ways it does set the stage for what we're here about at this conference on precession, ancient knowledge, and really pushing things way back. And this work that goes back almost 2 decades now for myself personally really set the stage for much of what has come later. And I'm not claiming any credit here, I'm giving credit to the Sphinx. And it's also changed my life. Sometimes I think, usually I think for the better, sometimes I wonder what I got myself into. So I really started on the Sphinx work when I was very young. This is me about 20 years ago. And what it really indicated doing, at least for some people, and this was part of the controversy and part of why we're here now, is talking about, you know, if you push the day of the Sphinx back, does it mean that we have to view history differently? Do we have to rewrite history? And that's what's been suggested by many people, maybe, you know, including myself at this point. I've never actually seen it that way in the sense that, well, okay, we have to rewrite things, we push things back. But I'm a geologist. I think in terms of long time periods anyway. So a few thousand years, what's the big deal? Well, I found out very quickly it's a real big deal to a lot of historians and Egyptologists. Just very quickly about my Sphinx work. Here is the Sphinx, and tie in with the talk we just presentation we just heard. I've actually always thought of her as having a feminine energy. But maybe she's androgynous, whatever. We won't get into that now. But she sits in her Sphinx enclosure, and what I've been working on as far as the Sphinx go, or basically this short version of the story, is you look at the enclosure. This is the body of the Sphinx. What we're really interested in from a geological point of view is the weathering, the erosion that we see on the body of the Sphinx and on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, because that's really where it's much better preserved. We saw that was preserved by sand. And the bottom line is, you study this carefully, it's caused by rain. It's caused by precipitation. And it's very clear. I mean, this is textbook geology, as many geologists have said to me when I present it. There's nothing very sophisticated here, and that compares to the type of weathering you see elsewhere on the plateau, which is caused by wind, basically wind gouging out the soft layer. Very different type of weathering. Wind erosion on the right versus rain erosion. This is the bottom line I could talk about for 3 hours in great detail, but I'm not going to today. So wind versus rain. And what's the implications of this? The implication is that for the last 5,000 plus years, from dynastic times basically up to the present, we have only had hyper-arid conditions. Very little rain, less than a couple of centimeters a year nowadays, just not the amount of rain to get the erosion that you see on the body of the Sphinx in the Sphinx enclosure. So you just don't have it. It just doesn't make sense. But we know geologically, and this is well established, that it was a very different environment before 3000 BC. This, according to this diagram, 7000 to 3000 BC, you have much more temperate, moist cloud cover, savanna-type conditions. Before that, you have a dry period going back in time, wet, dry, etc. So you have to push it back geologically to at least this earlier period, and you have to have it far enough back to be able to see the level of erosion that you see now. That's the bottom line without going into great detail. So it goes back by my best estimates, and not just based on surface weathering, but subsurface weathering also, at least to 5,000 BC, a couple of thousand years earlier, could be much older than that, in fact. But conservatively, I've always said it's at least 5,000 BC, and that's enough to upset, I guarantee you, a lot of Egyptologists. This was incredibly radical. A lot of people claimed I had no context for this 18, 20 years ago. Since then, in the last 2 decades, more and more information's been coming out from established archaeology, et cetera. For instance, I mentioned this one in particular, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. And here we have a good German archaeologists in particular have been working on this, and they are finding, lo and behold, what they call major building phases from the same period in time. So I feel in many ways, and this is just one example. We're getting more and more around the world where you get incredible structures, carvings from this same Sphinx age. I'll call it the Sphinx age period. So now we are no longer talking isolation for this very early period. So in many ways, I feel after all that abuse I've taken over the years, at least starting to be vindicated. I've looked at the geology so thoroughly and had so many people come after me and criticize it. In many cases, only to say, well, I'm talking to my geological colleagues. They say, well, in fact, you're right. I'm certain it will stand up to the test of time. So given that, let's move on from there. This is sort of my own personal history. The Sphinx is very old indeed. And I believe that, as we've heard already, we've been talking about, and we'll talk more about this conference, you're talking about very ancient advanced civilization at a much earlier period in time, and you're talking about lost knowledge. And I think lost knowledge and lost wisdom. So this really set me on a quest, which I've been going on ever since, which I'm certainly not at the end of. I've traveled around now for the last 20 years to a number of areas. This is in Peru. We've already heard quite a bit about Peru. This is actually a very interesting spot known as Markawasi, which I'm planning to get back to with some of the people in the audience in early next year. Incredible site. In fact, something that you have here is similar to what we were talking about before, these almost like a proto-sculptures, proto-structures. And also, many of these sacred sites, let me say this right now, have people experience things there. They have very powerful experiences, if I could use that term. And we'll come back to that. So this is Markawasi, some of the people that visited earlier. This is known as the Healing Cross or Sacred Cross. In Markawasi, it's hard to tell, but if I go back just a little bit in this picture, I would fall off a major cliff and not be here to tell you about. But many of these have geomagnetic anomalies. I'll come back to that also, and seem to affect people's consciousness. Classic example, slide I took when I was last there, Machu Picchu. We've already heard a bit about Machu Picchu. But I'm really looking at these from both a geological perspective and why are they building there in the way why are they building the way they are? Nazca lines, I won't get into that now. Even in other parts, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but the Eastern, not just in the Americas, I want to say, but also in the so-called Old World. This is a site actually in Wales, burial mound, Scotland, Bosnia. Don't worry about Bosnia too much. That pyramid is not a real pyramid. But it's still a very interesting site diving off of this. Some people are familiar with this, Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan. But coming back to Egypt, let's talk about Egypt just a little bit more. This is the Great Pyramid, and an aerial view of the 3 pyramids on the Giza Plateau. Zahi Hawass, some people know him? Yep. And going through the Great Pyramid. One thing that's interesting about the Great Pyramid, there we go, whoop, it was not advancing properly. One thing that's interesting about the Great Pyramid is you have this incredible structure, the Grand Gallery in it. And you crawl through a little, people who've been there know this, you crawl through a little ascending passage on your hands and knees to then open up into this huge gallery, and the only way out of it is, or beyond it, is through another crawl on your hands and knees. What is going on here? Are they just doing this for trifle purposes, to bury a pharaoh, etc.? Something that ties in with the theme of this conference, so I want to mention it very briefly, is that I believe the best explanation for what's going on with the Grand Gallery in the Great Pyramid, and there's many other aspects to the Great Pyramid, is something that was actually proposed by Richard Proctor back in 1883. He was a very famous, at the time, English astronomer, very well known, and he looked at the Great Pyramid and said, well, obviously, to him, it was only built up to the 50th level initially, and you looked out the Grand Gallery, it was basically a sighting tube. To sight out the Grand Gallery open to the sky, it's perfectly aligned north-south, and to measure the skies, basically to make astronomical observations. And I believe this ties in with their whole concept of precession, their whole concept of interest in the skies, as we've already heard about. And I believe at least the Great Pyramid, at one point, one phase, was being used as a huge astronomical observatory. It explains a lot of different aspects as to why it's set up the way it is. This is the Grand Gallery, this is looking down. Actually, this is how he reconstructed the platform. Those that are familiar with astrology and the way that ancient horoscopes will often be depicted, can you see how this is the 12 houses and the way it was set up? I don't think that is coincidental. Here's, again, from Proctor, showing how the Grand Gallery would be used as a huge sighting tube for astronomical observations. I could say a lot more about the Great Pyramid. I won't now, except, it was built up maybe at 50th level at one point, used for sighting, then later this was built up afterwards. But something that's always fascinated me is this structure down here, which in fact I believe is much older than the rest of the superstructure, and that's the so-called pit or subterranean chamber. And you go down there, you go down the descending passage into the subterranean chamber, and this is what you find. It's a very strange place. It's not smooth. It's carved out of solid bedrock. Interests me as a geologist. And people often report strange, we'll call them changes in their psyche in this subterranean chamber. And again, like I said, many of these sites that have become interested in, people are talking about, we'll use the term paranormal, changes in consciousness, altered states, if you would. Subterranean chamber is known for that. Is there some way to objectively measure such things? Something that I've become very interested in is what people generally call psychical science, or research into paranormal, or parapsychology is the modern concept for it. Is there some way to get some objective measures to some of these things? This is one approach, using random event generators, and I'm sure many of you have heard about this. This was really pioneered in the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratories for about a quarter century. One of the best people is Roger Nelson. Essentially what they use is a random event generator, and you get numbers coming out of it. You're talking millions of trials. Each of these trials actually consists of numerous bits of data. And if it is just random like it should be, it just varies around plus minus 0, 1, however you calibrate it. And looking at a diagram like this, it should stay within this parabola if it's really random. And what's been demonstrated is in many cases it seems to pick up something, if you want to call it energy, consciousness, whatever, in certain circumstances. Roger Nelson, who was at the time with Princeton, took a random event generator to Egypt, and he took it to numerous, quote, sacred sites. This is the Komombo, one of the temples in Egypt, and this is what he picked up when he took it, not just into the temple, but into the Holy of Holies, the most sacred site. Do you see how it's going non-random? People see that? Yeah. Here's another example, Temple of Edfu. It's going non-random. Indicates, apparently by some kind of objective measurement as best we can, that something is happening there. Very interesting here, this is a Temple of Isis at Philae, and it is within the statistically what? Random. What's happening here? Well, I talked to him on the phone about this, and he said they were really surprised at this result, but then they went and they read the sign. What's happened to the Temple of Isis at Philae? It has been moved from its original position because of the Aswan High Dam. The Aswan High Dam was built. It flooded the original site. This was a big multinational project. The UN was involved, everything. To save some of the great archaeological sites of Egypt, at least the temples. Abu Simbel was moved. The Temple of Isis was moved. They reconstructed, but as a result, it's no longer at its original site. This, I think, is at least a partial argument that what's sacred about it is not the temple per se, not what was built by humans, but the actual site it was on. So essentially at this point, at least by this measure, it's a dead temple. Come back to the Great Pyramid. That's why the little digression on random event generators. Come back to the Great Pyramid. This is his data for the Great Pyramid. And you'll notice as he's going through it, going through the Queen's Chamber, going through the Grand Gallery, going through the King's Chamber, it's all basically random. Not what many people would expect. But what happened is when he went down to the Subterranean Chamber, unfortunately, he didn't have the same type of diagram. Why he didn't do that, I don't know. But when he went down there, that is where he found the major anomalous deviation. And he says, in his own words, that this is an objective measurement that something extraordinary is happening there. And that really the core of, I would argue, the core of the Great Pyramid, if it's a sacred site, is that subterranean chamber, not the King's Chamber, not other things. So this all became very interesting to me. So here's, again, that subterranean chamber. The pit. If you have the chance to go down there, if you go to Egypt, go down if you feel you can make it. So this was all very interesting to me. So returning to the Sphinx, I want to mention, this is something that was already mentioned very briefly, there was another, we'll call it a cyclical tie for me that really got me thinking about more things, and that is this person. Do people recognize him? Edgar Cayce. And Edgar Cayce predicted, I'll point out that he died before I was born, well before I was born. So he made a prediction that we ended up confirming. And I did not even know about this prediction. I have to say, I honestly did not know anything about it, and I was only told about it after we found what we found. And what we found was what he had predicted when he was in one of his dream states, if you would. He was known as the sleeping prophet, not exactly dream, but he would go into a trance-like state, which I think is important. We'll tie in with something else I talk about in a few minutes. The concept of going into a trance-like state and then tuning in to, if you would, the bigger picture, more information. He predicted, or he said, decades earlier, that there would be a chamber found under the Sphinx. Under the pause of the Sphinx, which he referred to as a hall of records. A hall of records of what? Come on. Hall of records of Atlantis. Now, I said Atlantis. There was at one time when I didn't say the, quote, A word, but I will now. Atlantis. So, okay, he predicted that. I didn't know anything about this. Other people maybe did, but we, John West and Tom DeBakey, we went as part of our initial work on the Sphinx, did seismic studies around it. There's the late Boris Said, and basically you pound on the rock and, we won't go into geophysics right now, but we did seismic studies around the Sphinx. What I was really interested in was looking at subsurface mineralogical changes, because this would either corroborate or disprove what I would see on the surface and my analysis of the earlier date for the Sphinx. I'm glad to say, otherwise I wouldn't be talking about that, the data we collected absolutely corroborated and allowed me to help calibrate the earlier Sphinx work. But we also found under the paws, and you see it in our diagram here, a chamber, particularly under the left paw. And there it is. How did Edgar Cayce know that ahead of time? Still hasn't been entered. In fact, it may be flooded from rising waters, which would be a shame. So it continues for me. So I'm still thinking about these things. And I'm getting more and more interested in these should we say, arcane or esoteric aspects. This person, I show this slide right here because there's a person standing here. Her name is Logan Yanoviak. She was one of my students at the time at Boston University. She served as a field assistant along with actually Brady in this case on this trip. As a field assistant on several trips with me, both to Egypt and also to Peru. This is actually us at Markawasi. And she and I are talking about this. I'd always had certain interest, but you have to suppress certain interests. At least I felt I had to suppress them, especially going to graduate school at Yale and, getting a PhD in geology and geophysics, being a good academic. You don't talk about your grandmother who was a theosophist and filled your head with all kinds of nonsense, right? So you just suppress these things. But I was actually always interested, at least from an academic point of view, in why people would believe in weird things and paranormal events and psychical phenomena. And, here, she is, she's this undergraduate, and she says, maybe we should just really look into all this. We've got all these stories, associated with these ancient sites. So the bottom line is that she and I actually undertook a project. She did partly as a directed study with me, and we literally went through the literature, looked at I don't know how many thousands of papers on serious research on the paranormal, parapsychological, etc. We initially went into it, quote, as skeptics, in a good sense, I want to say skeptics, and we thought we'd find, the best evidence for and against. Turns out there's not much evidence against. The evidence against is basically saying, well, it's fraud or something to that effect. I mean, it's just dismissal. We ended up getting into it so much that we put together a book called The Parapsychology Revolution. I'm not trying to push books right now, but you can pick up a copy of it. And I say that not because I'm trying to, push it, but because what we ended up doing was compiling selections from 14 major articles representative of some of the best research, including Nobel Prize winning, ones by a Nobel Prize winner. Most of them are, academic PhDs, etc., really looking at parapsychological, paranormal phenomena. So we put together 14 selections and 100 pages of our own commentary. Bottom line is, out of all this is, yes, there's something to it, and I am now willing to say that publicly and go on record. You can't just dismiss it. And unfortunately, too many people dismiss too many things nowadays, and this is much worse than it used to be. Back 100 years ago, and we include an article by him in the book, William James, for instance, a Harvard psychologist and great philosopher, much of his work was in parapsychology. Someone like Charles Richet, who won the Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine. So we're talking real scientists. We're not talking some, writer or something. Much of his work was in what we would now call parapsychology, and he was very clear there was something to it. In fact, he and others helped develop modern statistical techniques to address parapsychological issues. Statisticians don't like to admit things like that now. Brian Josephson, who is a living Nobel Prize laureate in physics, has gotten himself in trouble just recently. We talk about this in our commentary for, when I say got himself in trouble, got in the ire of other scientists, other physicists dumping on him, so to speak, because he acknowledges that there's something to the paranormal, and he even talks about how quantum physics may explain it, etc., his own field. So there's something to it. So that's my point there, and we'll come back to that in 2 minutes. So we've got a very ancient Sphinx. This is my thinking now. We've got advanced people in very ancient times. We've got sophisticated astronomy. I mentioned that about the pyramid, Great Pyramid. We've heard before about, it's very clear that the ancients knew about precession. And where you have astronomy, at least in ancient times, and right up to the type of Kepler, for instance, you have astrology. And that was the reason for much of the astronomy. And I mean astrology here, I'm thinking in terms of not so much natal astrology, but what really interests me is mundane astrology. How do the cosmic influences affect things here on Earth in the most general sense? And I believe that the ancients, and we've seen a little bit of this already in previous talks, had a very deep understanding of the psyche, the human psyche, and even the world psyche, if I could use that term. So how about patterns in history? Here we are at the conference on CPAC, Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge. I almost said backwards, ancient knowledge and precession. On Conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge, many of us here are at least open to the concept of something different than the typical concept of history that pervades most of conventional science, most of conventional history academics today. You all know that the conventional view right now is that it's progressive. We go from bad old cavemen, as John West might say, to good old us, smart old us. That's a one-way linear view of history. This is what most of the general public thinks about. How they can in this day and age, I'm not sure, but that we're sort of getting better and better. Continued improvement. This is not the typical view of history when you look at, views of history going back into medieval times and ancient times, etc. In fact, there's a long tradition, as all of you know, that there's a cyclical view, that history is cyclical, that history and time are cyclical, and furthermore interconnected. And we'll hear more about this at the conference later, but two of the major cycles are, of course, the Yuga Cycle from the Far East versus the more Western, represented here on a coin from ancient Egypt, of the precessional cycle, and you've heard about both of these. Just to explain it a little more, at least to refresh your memory, the Yuga cycle of going through a golden age in the past, into a silver, bronze, iron age, and etc. And people argue about the timing of these cycles and exactly where are we now? Are we in the Kali Yuga, or have we moved slightly out of it? I'm not going to address that right now. Or the precessional cycle, the Western precessional cycle, we're somewhere at the end of the age of Pisces. I didn't hear it playing as mood music, but what's that old song? The Age of Aquarius, dawning of the Age of Aquarius, right? Everyone's heard that, But in fact, we are somewhere close to the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. If you go back in time, before the Age of Pisces, Age of Aries, Age of Taurus, Age of Gemini, the twins. So is there something to this? So this is another thing I've been thinking about as I've been getting involved in all these things. So it's in astrology, okay, another A word. Do we dare talk about this? Maybe we have to. The concept of planetary and cosmic forces affecting the Earth, maybe another fragment of ancient wisdom, ancient knowledge that's much maligned in modern times. And I'm not talking obviously about astrology that you read in the newspaper. So, is there something to all this? So I started thinking about this. Looking at my beloved Egypt, can we correlate or think about precessional cycle, precessional ages, maybe correlating with collective consciousness? For instance, Age of Gemini, the twins. Does that tie in with the two kingdoms? Everyone knows Egypt traditionally started with two kingdoms, dynastic Egypt, that were unified. Age of Taurus, we see at one point in what I'll call Old Egypt, the motif of the bull, the cow. We've already heard a little bit about that in earlier talks. Later, the Age of Aries, the ram motif. We see that, for instance, at Karnak heavily. Age of Pisces, very interesting. To me, what's the oldest symbol for Christianity? It's not a cross, it's a fish. With the Age of Pisces. People were very aware at the time that a new world age was being entered. So, could there be something to these ages? I don't have time to make the case that there is. Let's just assume there is potentially. If there are different ages, different types of consciousness dominating the world ages, could this tie in with real changes in the larger environment? And that's what I want to address very briefly. So what could determine world ages? What could cause changes in human psyches? In the human collective, we'll call it mindset. And the first clue for me was something I'm familiar with, something I felt comfortable with, because I have a PhD in geology and geophysics, and that is geomagnetism. Could that affect something? And this is, I think, a very important quote just worth looking at for a second. It's a paper called Geomagnetism and Anomalous Experiences, 1868 to 1980, by Wilkinson and Gauld, and it's also quoted in Parapsychology Revolution if you want to look at more later. But they analyzed cases of apparent paranormality, spontaneous telepathy, poltergeist instances, and they came to a conclusion, comparing this to the geomagnetic flux over time. In the end, we were left with a residuum of positive findings. There's a weak but persistent statistical relationship between lowish absolute levels of geomagnetic activity and the occurrence of spontaneous cases of apparent telepathy, clairvoyance. That's number one. Two, there's a small tendency for the days of onset of the cases of poltergeists and hauntings to be days of higher than usual geomagnetic activity. What underlies these observed relationships remains to be determined. Now, this is very important to me as a natural scientist. The critics, the debunkers can say, well, all this is nonsense. Telepathy, clairvoyance is nonsense. Well, if it's all nonsense and it's all fraud and they're all faking it, how is it that they're faking it in correlation with something that most people aren't even aware of, or at least certainly don't know when the geomagnetic flux is going up and down? Talk about huge conspiracy. Am I making sense? So to me, this right away suggests there's something real to it if it's correlated with real natural phenomena. And furthermore, if it's correlated with real natural phenomena, remember, correlation does not mean causation, but it does mean something. It does lend a clue. Likewise, people are aware of the concept of remote viewing. Basically, you can call it a type of telepathy, clairvoyance. This is from an article that we have in Parapsychology Revolution about remote viewing used for military purposes by Bremseth. And I want to quote this, local sidereal time. So now we're talking about something beyond just on Earth, but in our relationship to the Milky Way galaxy. Local sidereal time reflects the relationship between the center of our galaxy, the Milky Way, and the Earth's horizon in relation to an individual's location at any point on the Earth. When the galaxy center is below the Earth's horizon, human cognitive and anomalous performance, such as remote viewing, dramatically improves by an order of magnitude as compared to when the galaxy center is above the Earth's horizon. This is incredibly interesting. I mean, things are happening relative to cosmic factors. And this is well established. I wouldn't have reprinted it if I hadn't researched and confirmed it myself. An analogy might be a moving telescopic lens in front of an eye. When the lens lines up perfectly with the eye, vision is extremely enhanced, but only as long as the alignment lasts. So another clue that something outside of even our solar system is affecting us, and affecting us consciously. Geomagnetism. There seems to be a correlation with geomagnetism. This is just a standard geomagnetic scale. All geologists are familiar with it. One thing you want to see is that over millions of years, the geomagnetism has varied greatly at different levels, different periods. There's been periods for tens of millions of years it hasn't changed. Other periods where it fluctuates like crazy. It's fluctuating like right now, like crazy. And I say like crazy in geologic time. It's not. It's actually fluctuating on a daily basis too. And I don't have time to get into all that type of thing. We need to talk a little bit about physics. I want to mention a few things about physics of vibration. A lot of skeptics, a lot of debunkers will say the types of things I'm going to talk about can have no effect whatsoever on humans because they're so weak, they're too small, etc. One thing you have to realize is that the concepts of resonance and amplification, what we'll call subtle energies, very small energies, in vibrations, in electromagnetic vibration, acoustic vibration, gravitational vibrations, quantum level vibrations, if they're in resonance, if they're in harmony, if you would, resonance, they amplify and they can have very profound effects. That's just simply well-known physics. I want to talk about a few in particular very quickly. Electromagnetic radiation in the Earth's atmosphere. Those that have been here before may have heard John Daring talk about things like this. Schumann resonances. These are basically electromagnetic resonances in the Earth's atmosphere between the surface and the ionosphere. What am I talking about? We see, of course, by visible light, which is electromagnetic resonance. Visible light has a very high frequency, short wavelength. We're talking about extremely low frequency, ELF, very long wavelength electromagnetic radiation. These radiations circle around the Earth. This is well known geophysically. And in fact, what this is showing diagrammatically is some of these Schumann resonances, they go into resonance around the Earth, and their wavelength is long enough that a single wavelength can encircle the Earth. Sometimes people say, well, paranormal phenomena can't be affected or are not a function of electromagnetic radiation. Just want to make a side comment on that. These are so low frequency, long wavelength radiation that they're not taken out by things like Faraday cages, so they don't apply to that. They vary with season because the ionosphere varies. Here's Schumann resonances showing up here. Here are measures of Schumann resonances. This is cycles per second, or hertz. So 7, 14, 21, 26, some of the basic Schumann resonances. Another type of wave I think you're familiar with is brain waves. Okay, brain waves are also electromagnetic in character, or electrical in character, I should say. And is this just coincidental? They also have frequencies in the same types of ranges, about 0 up to 30, 40 hertz per hertz, cycles per second. And Schumann resonances and frequencies, brain waves, frequencies dovetail with each other. And this is very interesting, I think. It's now been demonstrated just in the last couple of years that humans are susceptible to these extremely low frequencies. Alpha waves, people have heard of alpha waves for basic cognitive functions, tend to be in the 8 to 13 hertz, right between the Schumann nodes. Versus theta waves, which is the type of waves when you go into a deep meditation, many people go into a deep meditation, they actually correspond with this Schumann resonance. So you've got these correspondence. Alpha waves, it seems, I believe, that you can literally tune in and tune out to the world. And when you're doing certain types of things, certain cognitive functions, you don't want to be interfered with the rest of the world, essentially, or with Schumann resonance. So those alpha waves are in here. When you're going into deep meditation, for instance, you literally tune in to the rest of the world, and other people are tuning in. And this can be demonstrated experimentally. Side note, modern civilization. Here we measure the Schumann resonances. This is in Sweden. These measurements we're taking. Look at this spike. This is artificial. This is because of electrification in the Swedish railroads. Not a good thing. This is taken in America. Here's the Schumann resonances. Do you see that? Look at these sharp spikes. That's because of basically pollution, human electromagnetic pollution. Very sharp spike at 60 hertz. Of course, our electricity comes in as alternating current at 60 hertz. You start looking at this, comparing this to brain waves, the Schumann resonances. Look what's happening. Alpha waves, here we have an industrial spike or pollution at that point. I mean, how can anyone focus and function with this type of impingement mentally? Likewise, for higher cognitive functioning, beta waves are important, yet we have impact there. Schumann resonances are affected. I was talking to someone last night, and we were talking about this, affected by climate. Everyone's aware of global climate change to this day. A lot of these resonances are affected because the ionosphere changes in height. Amount of lightning affects the resonances. Have people heard of HAARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program? This is blasting holes in the ionosphere and affecting this. Someone that I knew, he's now deceased, one of the great geologists from actually Australian, he pointed out that the planets, the sun, resonate. This affects ionosphere. This affects extremely low frequency electromagnetic waves. Okay, I got to get into a few other things in the last few minutes. Evidence for correlations between nuclear decay rates and Earth-Sun distance. This just came out in August. Essentially, radioactive decay. If you're not familiar with radioactive decay, some atoms are unstable. Some nuclei are unstable. You have some in your body. Common one is carbon-14. Everyone has it in their body in very low amounts, and they break up spontaneously. This is supposed to be a fundamental constant of nature. That's one of the underpinnings of much of physics. What has been found recently is that when you measure these so-called constants, they fluctuate. This has generally been attributed to experimental error. The machine isn't good, that type of thing. But when you start plotting this, and this was what Jenkins and Fischbach have done recently, you get a pattern. Moreover, that correlates with what? The orbital parameters of the sun and the Earth going around the sun, basically the Earth-Sun distance. This is for radioactive silicon, this is radioactive radium. Do you see that correlation? Not supposed to be the case. This sure sounds like another aspect of traditional astrology, cosmic influences on things in humans. This just came out 2 days ago, was pointed out to me. Some reactions from classical physicists. As more scientists hear about the claimed relationship of decay constants, well, it's not so constant, it turns out, to solar activity, reactions vary from disbelief to rejection. I don't understand this at all. What could it possibly be? Says John Barrow. It's a gigantic effect. It sounds as though it's related to solar activity, but it really can't be. If a student brought this to me, I would advise them to understand their experiment before they start coming up with wild correlations of detector noise. They're calling it noise. How do you dismiss it? You just call it noise. Sounds like what they said to us about the Sphinx initially. Something else I really have to mention, and I'm going to ask your forgiveness, I need a couple more minutes, is a realization of discrete states. This is Russian work, this is what they call it, during fluctuations in macroscopic processes. Very important, I believe. Okay, this is also carbon-14. You measure it over a certain period of time. You measure the impulses per minute, and it's about 1250, a little under 1250 on average. You get your distribution. Sometimes you get a little higher, a little lower, and basically this is just noise. Obviously, it should be a nice bell curve, right? That's what classical physics would say. This is just spread, typical spread, random noise. You eliminate that. I can't draw very smoothly, but it should be a nice bell curve. And as you take more and more data, you'll approach this nice bell curve. That is the conventional wisdom. What's the reality? The reality is, and they've studied this now for some 40 years, in Russia, you start doing this, you take other measurements, other samples synchronously. Do you see how it doesn't fit into the nice bell curve? See what's happening? It's giving the same pattern. Something is going on here. They take thousands and tens of thousands of samples. They don't get the nice bell curve. They get the same patterns happening simultaneously. There's a message here. There's data in this. And what has been ignored for so long by conventional science, what we'll call the fine structure, there's data here. There you have 15,000 measurements. And they found furthermore that you get different patterns at different times. So what they're doing is comparing different measurements. If you take them exactly the same time in different parts of the world, and they've done this over thousands of miles, you get very similar patterns. So time zero synchronously, and as they vary from that time, you get different patterns. If you take different measurements of even different types of processes, biological processes versus physical processes, you get similar patterns if they're done simultaneously. If you take measurements and you measure every hour over time periods, look what happens. What this is a measure of similarity, you repeat the cycle every 24 hours. You come back to the same types of measurements. You do this even longer periods, you start getting measurements repeating 27.3 days later. That's the lunar cycle, but the lunar cycle relative to the stars, the sidereal month. Something is happening here. Just like with decay rates, there are cosmic factors affecting basic physical and biological processes. You see it in a yearly cycle. It turns out that you start measuring these things against solar activity, solar flares and whatnot, and I could talk more about that, but don't have time now, and you get a correlation again, in this case an inverse correlation. Okay, this is a very important quote. This is a Russian commentator, not one of the persons involved in actual research, but someone who was evaluating it. It is demonstrated that the fine structure of the histograms for quite diverse random processes, physical, chemical, biological, etc., are similar and vary in sympathy. Moreover, these periodical changes correlate with changes in our solar system and possibly in our universe. What does this sound like? Doesn't this sound like something that could be driving precessional cycles, driving changes, not just in human consciousness, but other things? I'm a geologist. I'll just throw this up. This is showing extinction cycles over hundreds of millions of years. One field, and maybe I'm lucky in that sense, the field I'm involved looks seriously at long-term cycles, whether they're tens of thousands of years, or even tens of millions and hundreds of millions of years. So I think something's happening here. Getting back to human consciousness, Schumann Resonances seem to be able to carry information. You can literally use them for communication forms. They do that with submarines because they're the one frequency that will penetrate deep into the water. We are affected by Schumann Resonances. Organisms are affected by them. These biological, these chemical processes are affected by what seem to be very, very subtle factors of the cosmos. And we have a mutual effect. The whole business of consciousness and psi, mind over matter, if you would, telepathy, altered states, if you want to use those terms, is affected by electromagnetism, geomagnetism, by local sidereal time, by quantum physical effects, and we affect other organisms and vice versa. Very good example of that, I'll mention, and I know what time it is, is the work of a guy named Cleve Baxter. You may have heard of this. He was a polygraph expert. He still is. And just for fun, some decades ago, I guess it's his idea of fun, he hooked up a plant to a polygraph and started thinking about burning the plant, harming the plant. The plant went crazy. It sensed it. And the thing about this is that skeptics, even for some of these like skeptic debunking TV shows, they've been very embarrassed when they've tried to run the same experiment to debunk it, and guess what? They get the same results. And then they're scrambling to try to figure out how to explain it away, by a conventional point of view. I want to throw in last two quotes because Walter had said to give some quotes. At least he'd asked that for the brochure. So just as I wind up, one of the great early workers on psychical research was a guy named Frederick W.H. Myers. And he threw out the idea, which I think is very interesting, that telepathy and these cyclical phenomena are sort of like gravity in the material world, and it holds us all together. And furthermore, if you think about gravity, the planets going around the sun, one planet changes its orbit a little bit, it pulls the other planet. So not only does it hold things together, but everything affects everything else. Great quote here, I think, in his old sort of 19th century English. If we can suppose telepathy to occupy in the spiritual world some such place as gravitation occupies in the material world, we might imagine something analogous to the force of cohesion as operating in the cyclical texture of human personality. Basically, we're all interconnected. And I think that in a very real, literal sense, not sort of hocus pocus, or as some of my students would say, woo-woo sense, we resonate with the universe. We literally do. As we travel through space, as the Earth travels through, we resonate, we change, and I think there is a mechanism that can account, as we explore these things, for changing mass consciousness. Conventional wisdom does not acknowledge, I believe, adequately how connected we are to the cosmos, and perhaps it's very difficult to perceive that which is so subtle from our very limited perspective, both limited historical perspective, limited personal perspective. It's very hard to perceive sometimes the very big picture and very big, subtle but important changes. And I'll end with this quote. This is from, if you know, I mentioned, I think that my grandmother was a theosophist, and this is one of the persons that was very involved in theosophy, Charles Webster Leadbeater. And his famous quote, "It's one of the commonest of our mistakes to consider that the limit of our power of perception is also the limit of all that there is to perceive." And I think we really need to take that seriously. When I first got involved in the Sphinx 20 years ago, the way I perceived the world, what I perceived when I first saw her, first saw the Sphinx, is very different than the way I perceive the world now. I mean, I've been influenced, I've been changed, and possibly for the better. I think for the better, but I have a very different perception. I think a much more realistic perception of the way the world is. And I'm sure as I continue to study and attend these conferences and interact, it's going to change again. But I will leave it there, and thank you very much. And I want to say, that's the mystery of the Sphinx that John West and I were involved in, and that really got a lot of this going. Charlton Heston, the late Charlton Heston, hosted it, and just a couple of books you can pick up. Thank you. I'm sorry, I did my best.